So we continue. We're hopelessly badly doing with time. So Dave and I, we thought that we put to you the idea that we drop the discussion groups for today at the end, so that we have time for the climate unions and climate change plenary session now, and we can go on through 5:30 and then break off for today for evening meal, and then there's the film and discussion for those who would like to after dinner. Is that fine?
Yes.
Okay, great. There's not much choice. I apologize. Okay, so I'm very happy to introduce Sean Sweeney, who everybody has met already, I'm sure, because he's working for his trade unions for energy democracy, worldwide network he puts a lot of work into, but you will talk about it yourself. So you'll start, and then afterwards Chris Baugh, okay, is taking over from Public Commercial Services Union from the UK, and Bert again is going to add as well some aspects.
I'm going to pose a question.
Okay, right, okay. They'd have some sort of agreement. Okay, Sean, please start.
Great, thanks, Chris. First of all, thanks to the organisers for putting this on the agenda. It's not many years ago, it was a completely non-issue as far as unions are concerned. And it's been a bit of an uphill struggle to get it in the trade union discourse generally. And what I want to do is not just talk about climate change, although I think it's necessary to at least summarise where things are and what it's all about for those who don't follow it too much, but also to maybe talk about what's a left trade union progressive position that really deals with the question of it's a systemic crisis, and it's easy to say, well, it's capitalism, stupid, get rid of capitalism, we'll deal with climate change, when what is really needed is a trade union, a working class program that is transitional. In other words, how can we get from here to there? And I'm focusing particularly on energy, because that is the crucial question around climate. If you can't control the energy sector, the energy system, how it's used, how it's produced, how it's distributed, then you're not going to be able to solve the climate problem. It's as simple as that. And that's a point I'd like to start with. So here's my little presentation. Naomi Klein used this phrase at a union conference, the launch of a big union in Canada, a new union called Unifor, which was a merger of the Canadian auto workers and the energy and paper workers. Many of those energy workers work in very, very dirty fossil fuel industries. And she said, climate change is a weapon. In other words, all the things we fight for as unions, there is more urgency embedded in that fight if we know what's at stake. And the climate situation is such that everything we do as a union around inequality, anti-austerity, workers' rights, is embedded now, or is tied to the climate question in a very, very real way. It's no longer, oh, do we have to stop everything and we're under attack as a union, now we're going to go and do climate change? Give me a break. Very few unions are going to take that on unless it empowers and builds the union, appeals to members, raises the profile of the union, and also brings real benefits and gains in the short term as well as over the longer haul. So I won't read these out because people don't like text on a screen, and this is the only bit of text I'm going to really put up there. There's a couple more I sneak in along the way. But the last point I would mention is this. It's not a perfect formulation to say a new climate and class politics is emerging. But it's even more awkward to call it a socio-ecological movement. But I think that is what is happening. We are seeing the rise of a movement that's not just about climate change, but it's about the degradation of land and water, and also the degradation of human beings. So what's happening is we live in a system that extracts. It takes from nature, and it takes from people, and it dumps us, and it dumps nature. In other words, it's part of the same system, so we must look at it as a collective, a total problem. So here's our friend now, the Holy Father. Actually, this has caused a bit of a stir, at least in the United States, amongst the Catholic community. And I suspect in other parts of the world, or maybe not, but the Pope's encyclical on climate change and environmental degradation is really, really being talked about. And there's the whole document, 150 pages, is very apolitical. It doesn't mention the word corporations once. It certainly doesn't mention neoliberalism. But it does say our nation is in danger. And the reason is because we treat people and nature as a commodity, as something that we can use and throw away. And I thought that's a powerful message, at least for some communities. Now, a lot of the climate conversation is about emissions levels, and sometimes when you start showing these charts, it gets really boring, and what's that got to do with us? But I think it's important just to get a sense of you see that red line there? That's business as usual. If we carry on at the same level of economic activity, that is taking us to 6 degrees Celsius, that's 11 degrees Fahrenheit, of global warming within the lifetime of children born today. So if you know, which we all do, small kids, by the time they're in adulthood or in old age, we are in a planet that is largely unlivable in vast areas. And many parts of the planet today are under all sorts of climate-related stress. And so climate change affects the global south, poorer communities, working class communities, more than it does the rich, who can usually buy their way out of the problem. But it's a civilizational crisis nonetheless. And then the question is, if it's going up, this is what it's got to do. This is the consensus of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a group of scientists, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 now, that provide data that gets analysed, and then every 5 years they produce a report. And they basically say that 2 degrees warming is the absolute maximum. So 6 degrees is completely off the charts. And this is the trajectories they've offered in terms of bringing the emissions down. But these are just targets. Getting to that target, getting to 2 degrees, which is also a controversial. Some people think it should be much less than that, 1 degree, 1.5 degrees, but that's the target. So the challenge is clear. The question is, how do we get there? Sorry about that. Someone's just about to call up and give me the answer, right. So you've probably seen lots of articles, those of you who follow environmental issues, there's lots of articles like this and major studies. There must be thousands of studies that say it's technically possible, we can do it, we can reduce emissions quite dramatically, have 100% renewable energy, which would really knock a big hole in emissions levels, and it can be done. So there's loads of engineers and scientists who do this kind of work. They even show how we phase up solar, utility scale solar, offshore wind, onshore wind, energy conservation, and so on. In other words, to take fossil fuels out of the system and bring in renewable sources of power. So there's a lot of this energy transition talk. Now, the solution of big business is one wing of big business acknowledges the problem. So they say, so what we've got to do is incentivize the green economy. Let's make sure people make money out of investing in green, whether it be tax breaks, various forms of grants, subsidies, government buying electrical power from renewable power companies at high rates. So that's one way to go, is to make sure capitalists make money, and that's the way to drive it. That's the green capitalist agenda. And there are other companies who say, we don't give a flying give a damn about it. We're just carrying on business as usual. We're going to continue to make money, particularly the fossil fuel companies. I'll come back to those in a moment. But this is the kind of speech of the green capitalists. We're all going to, everybody can make money out of it. It's all going to be fine. And we'll create jobs. And this has had an influence on the trade union community, particularly in the richer countries. Green jobs. Yeah, let's get a few green jobs out of this climate crisis and everything will be fine. This guy has a particular influence over the trade unions. His name is Achim Steiner. He's the head of the United Nations Environment Programme. And I mention him because the United Nations Environment Programme has an alliance, an arrangement with the International Trade Union Confederation. So I'm not just sticking his picture up there for fun. He actually has a lot of influence over union discussions on climate change. And he says, like the green capitalist, that it's inevitable, that there will be a green transition. Now, he keeps saying it louder and louder as all the evidence suggests it's not happening. So he's denying the reality, which is it's actually getting less green, not more green. So I'll skip through these quickly. Europe is particularly important. Here's the clean energy or renewable energy in Europe patterns. The spike there around 2010-11 is only as high as it is because of basically stimulus packages brought out post the recession, which bought into green power. That has all dried up now, and what you're seeing there is a decline in investment in renewable energy. It's pretty true all around the world. There's a few exceptions, but largely speaking, the flagship of renewable energy was Europe for the most part, and that is actually going down. Now, the amount of money invested and the amount of installations, you won't go into it, that, you know, it's more complicated than I have time to deal with now. But in many cases, certainly in energy, is not happening. This is a picture of global fossil fuel consumption. You'll see the arrow there, Kyoto. That was the Kyoto Treaty that was put in place in the mid-90s and the late 90s to reduce emissions in a certain number of countries. You can see what kind of an effect that had on emissions. Clearly not very much. Now, these next few slides are going to just tell you a bit more about what's going on in the energy system, just so people are clear, and the trade unionists should be clear about where energy is going. This is oil consumption by region. You can see the Asia Pacific is the top band, that's growing the fastest. But also you'll see globally oil consumption is going up. Here we have gas production and consumption by region. Same picture, more production, more consumption. This is the most dramatic of all, is coal consumption. Coal cooks the planet like no other fuel. It is a terrible emitter and a health hazard. But you can see Asia Pacific again. Half of the coal consumed today in the world is consumed in China. It imports some of it, but it also has a lot of domestic supplies. This means business as usual. Business as usual means that fossil fuel use will continue to expand. This is the electricity sector. You'll see on the right there a growth in renewable power. All the windmills you see, the solar, that's going to add up to something. But when you have expanding demand for energy globally, 3 or 4% increase a year, and 3/4 of it is being met by fossil fuels, yes, renewable energy may grow, but fossil fuels is going to meet the bulk of the demand, which is why they talk about the great age of carbon. The next great age of carbon is coming. Coal, oil, gas, and increasingly unconventional fuels. This is new sources of fossil fuels. This is specifically oil and gas. What do you notice about this world map? A lot of it is in the global south. So they're finding new resources, which means for workers and communities, farmers, that adds up to more pollution, more exploitation, but certainly no shortage of supply. So forget about peak oil and peak coal. What we are seeing, though, is the growth of unconventional fuels. This has got enormous significance for trade unions, because it used to be that you would stick a drill in the ground and the oil would come out. Now, the oil is in rock. It's not in conventional oil wells under the ground or under the sea. So that means exploding the rock, putting massive amounts of water and chemicals in it to get at oil in the rock or gas in the rock. That's what fracking is all about. This is an aerial view of part of Texas. There are worse pictures than this. This is fracking wells, the uglification of big parts of the US territories, and there's now fracking proposed in 12 countries, including this country. Other unconventional fuels, tar sands. I don't know if you have heard, how many people have never heard of the tar sands? It's okay if you haven't. Well, it sounds like you have. So this is an industrial project the size of England. If you got in a helicopter, it would take you almost a day to go from one end to the other. This is the biggest industrial project on Earth, and it's in Alberta. This is what the big fight in the US over the Keystone XL pipeline is. Get that sludge out into refineries in Texas and sell it to those who want it, largely India, China, and the Asia Pacific countries. That's basically the agenda. A few more minutes? Right. Okay, so what does it mean? You can't get the stuff out by pipeline, so they've been carrying it by train. This is a common sight now in North America. You can see by that statistic there, more oil spilled in US and Canada in the entire period of the last 35, 37 years. This disaster was in Quebec. 47 people killed. The train exploded. It explodes not because it's oil, but because it's diluted bitumen from the tar sands. What does that mean? It's a sludge that's got chemicals in it, and those chemicals are highly inflammable. So one accident, boom, the whole town went up in flames. The fire was a kilometre in radius. A phenomenal event. 47, not long ago. Now, business as usual is the problem. The political scenario is that drives the politics. I don't think I need to tell anybody in this room that when you're billionaires and you control government, you control climate politics. So all the talks, all the speeches about climate change made by world leaders add up to nothing if you cannot impede and reverse business as usual. That's the task we face as a movement and as a civilization. Now, as I said earlier, a new class in climate politics is emerging. This on the left is a picture of the People's Climate March in New York, which I was had some role in. I obviously was in it, but it was 400,000. We got the unions out for that. On the right is the Indignado movement, and what we see is a coming together of a common narrative. Yes, they're two separate movements in many ways, but they are speaking a similar language. You see this with the election. Not just the program of Syriza, which is for a new economic and ecological paradigm, a transition to 100% renewable power under public control. It's not going to be easy to implement that program given what's going on in Greece now, but it's a coming together of those two narratives, which I think we can take some heart from in the labour movement. Now, but the problem we have, first of all, with unions is obviously we've got a big deal with a membership education. People are under stress at their jobs, they're fighting battles. How can we do this? It's not an easy challenge, not pretending that we've got a book that's going to tell you how to do it. But this is how not to do it. The unions, largely in Europe, have been influenced by the World Bank, believe it or not. Inclusive green growth. This on the left is a World Bank report. In the middle is Nicholas Stern. Sir Nicholas Stern, our friend and comrade Sharon Burrows, serves on the board of the advisory board of that process, which is all about green growth, green capitalism. And on the right is the ILO, which has its working towards sustainable development. And I couldn't resist quoting this. Governments can influence the market, says the ILO, and encourage the private sector towards a green transition and overcome the problems of missing private price signals. In this sense, public investment plays a complementary role to a larger market-based mechanism. Now, can you take that to any of your members and get them excited about that? First of all, it doesn't acknowledge the problem. It's the private corporations, largely the energy companies, but other big private corporations as well. So, here we go. Some unions, many of whom are in the GLI network, like NUMSA and others, have basically said we need a programmatic shift, and it has to be rooted in public ownership and the extension of democracy. Key to this is energy, I believe, although other sectors, the International Transport Workers Federation, the Rio Assembly in 2012 started talking about extending and defending the commons, talking in terms of reclaiming what has been sold and privatized. Take it back, reorganize and restructure. Big task, but unless we say what needs to be done, we're never going to be able to do it. We won't be telling the truth to our members, we won't be able to engage them in the solutions, and that's a big problem. So last couple of minutes, I'll talk just a very bit about trade unions for energy democracy. Incidentally, I'm inviting you all to have dinner tonight around, let's say, anybody wants to know more about this project, because I don't have enough time to go into detail. Particularly those unions there are quite a few unions are involved in it, but those who are curious about how to be involved, at 6:30 I'll set up a little table for us. I know one or two of you are already coming. It was launched in October 2012, and again, repeat what I said at the start. It's all very well saying it's capitalism stupid. We need to get rid of the system. The question is, unless we can have points of entry into the system, of areas of struggle where we can win, then we don't have much chance of getting rid of capitalism, in my view. We need to build the power, but we need to be clear about what we're trying to do if we ever had social power or political power. So in energy, we produce this material. We have to resist the agenda of the fossil fuel companies, which is more business as usual. We have to reclaim, take back into public ownership the energy sector. key parts of it, but we have to restructure it to allow community, local power, and the deployment of renewable energy, which can meet the world's energy needs, even as they're defined now. And we could redefine what those needs are. This is our latest document, Power to the People Towards Democratic Control of Electricity Generation. This basically goes into more detail of how we can do it. It's detailed, it's long, but union leaders are beginning to respond to it, and rank and file people too, those who've got the time and, no pun intended, energy to put into it. I'll conclude with Naomi Klein. She, I think, has done the climate movement and the labour movement a great service in writing her book, This Changes Everything. It tells the truth. The problem is not carbon dioxide, it's not methane, it's capitalism. It's a systemic problem. She also is a very strong supporter of the trade unions for energy democracy and will speak at labour movement gatherings whenever she can. She is a weapon for the labour movement as well. Please reach out to her and try to get engaged, because she's a phenomenal person and a great writer. So last word is, I think we need to have a very, very serious approach to reasserting public ownership, not just as a slogan, but as a program, an agenda for change that we can take to the members. In this country where we are now, 70% of the work of people want renationalisation of energy. That's an opinion poll done by the BBC. They also want British Rail renationalised. So why aren't we taking it as a movement? Instead, as we'll hear from other speakers, we're fighting over whether we should support fracking or not, which is deeply and will not solve the problem and will make climate change worse. So how do we transcend the immediate, the sectional interest, and have a big picture, something we can organise around, educate our members, involve them in the solutions? Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sean.
That was great.
And I hand over to Chris Baugh. He just told me that he's a former activist of many years. He was elected Assistant General Secretary of PCS. Nowadays, he's got a number of responsibilities. Among is the responsibility for unions and climate. Thank you, Chris.
Right. Well, first of all, it's yeah, thanks.
I want to take your
It would have been quite a test.
Yeah.
My notes, but I mean, first of all, thanks very much for the invitation, and it's a great pleasure to speak at the GLI event, and it's a great pleasure to pay tribute to the work of Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, a global think tank that recognises the importance of placing class right at the heart of the debate about climate change. And I'm very proud that PCS, amongst other unions, not just in the UK but internationally, a growing number of unions are supporting and affiliating. I can only encourage every union, any rep within any union, to argue that we should support trade unions for energy democracy. Apologies, it's a bit of a flying visit. I've had to come down today, I've got to go back. We've got some potential negotiations with the employer about the National Gallery dispute that we're engaged in at the moment. So it is unfortunate from my point of view that I can't spend more time with comrades here and enjoy these marvellous surroundings. But I just want to say, by any definition, these are pretty momentous times. If you use a few more local or parochial examples, there's a spate of strikes taking place in Britain today and over the course of the next few days. PCS members are engaged in this. George Osborne has stood up and declared the first Tory budget for 12 years. If we let him, inflicting even further misery on working class interests in the UK. You've got the Troika seeking to impose punitive terms upon the Greek working class, the long tradition of institutions like the IMF, from Argentina to Zambia, imposing neoliberal terms, and of course the punitive nature of the terms that they're attempting isn't just to punish the Greek workers, it's to warn off French workers, Spanish workers, the rest of Europe who may be tempted to follow the example that it is possible to stand up to austerity. And then, just chatting before, even the collapse of share prices on the Chinese stock exchange. These are, by any definition, momentous times on the planet. And I just want to say, in bringing solidarity, I make the observation that it's one of these words that are used often in speeches. It's bandied around. I think it's a good word. We need to hear more of it. It isn't just a utopian idea, although I would say with a world in crisis, it isn't just an opportunity to define what we're opposed to, but it's an opportunity to start discussing what sort of world we want to live in. And I make the point utopias have their place in that particular debate. But I also want to say that solidarity is a very practical concept. That gets overlooked. We all know that the very idea of organising in a workplace, in any industry or sector, in any conceivable way that the workers can organise, it is built on the idea of solidarity, of sticking together, looking out for one another. And I would suggest that's not just me saying that. Why would Margaret Thatcher have introduced anti-union legislation in the early 80s that outlaws what they call secondary action, but is in fact solidarity action? They understand the power that flows from solidarity because it is our most powerful weapon against the economic and political elites that are seeking to make the international working class pay the price of a crisis that we didn't cause. Now, I just want to say, before the context of a debate about unions and climate, I just want to say something about the context of this debate, because, of course, you can't escape the fact that we were told from the Reagan-Thatcher years, the last 30 years of high-octane free market, so-called free market capitalism. We're told we didn't need a manufacturing sector, that we should just have a finance sector with an explosion of credit and a reliance on reckless speculations. And I would, just on reckless speculation, I don't know whether anybody's ever seen the Michael Moore film, Capitalism, A Love Story, and I would recommend it for one particular scene, a very hilarious scene, where a Harvard professor and a disillusioned Wall Street trader can't even define what derivatives and futures actually are. But again, we were told that this was the route to prosperity, a service retail sector, contrary to Osborne's claim of high wages, in fact a low-wage casualised super exploitation, particularly of young women and migrant workers, a systematic attack on workers' rights, culminating in what Tony Blair, approvingly, I should say, describes as the most repressive anti-union laws in Western Europe. And I make again an important observation: many of these attacks would not have been successful were it not for the forces of the state, in a conscious and deliberate way, seeking to undermine the power of organised labour, most notably the attack on the NUM, which of course was designed to inflict a defeat not just on miners but the rest of the working class. And in areas like my own, where we organise in PCS, you've seen a public sector, deep cuts, a failed privatisation project, bringing in US business school theories in how management should conduct themselves, and we were told this was the route to economic prosperity. And then, in that pivotal month, between September and October in 2008, the international financial system came close to meltdown. Again, to mention Naomi Klein, in the eye of the storm, various pundits were invited in the Guardian newspaper to give some comment about what they thought it meant. And Naomi Klein made a quote that stuck in my mind, which is that the hype, that she said that after the bailout, to the speculators and the spivs who are responsible for the crisis, don't believe the hype that neoliberalism is finished. It will come roaring back in the form of deeper cuts, accelerated push to privatisation, and the government will also use this as an excuse to cut and undermine subsidies in any sort of support for the renewable sector. Now, I just want to say that, without dwelling on what it's been for the last 5 years, because PCS, in many respects, has been in the fight of its life, because we haven't just stood up to the government and played a pivotal role, I would argue, in trying to galvanise collective action against the attacks on the public sector, which again, I think it's fair to say that when the attacks are across the public sector, it's members in the unions, rather more so than some of the union leaders, that recognise the most effective response is collective action in response to that. But because of the role PCS has played, we've been targeted by the government. They've cut the time for our reps, they've sacked some of our reps, they've produced some incredible union-busting documents in the Department Revenue and Customs, which is supposed to collect the tax, incidentally. And this document can be found on our website, one of the most incriminating anti-union documents ever seen in the UK. And it talks about achieving the organisational degradation of PCS by reducing by targeting its local reps and reducing the influence of its leadership. And I make the observation that, of course, it's done not just because the Tories and the ruling elites are unpleasant people. They may or may not be, but on a personal level, who knows? They do this, and they attack PCS and they attack trade unions because they recognise that we stand in the way of their agenda. That's why they've always demonised and attacked trade unions, and that's why they always will. Now, that's the context for the general election result that created considerable despondency, not surprisingly. And I just make a passing observation that Margaret Thatcher, who it should be remembered was defeated, who was removed from office, and the hated poll tax that she introduced was defeated because of the biggest mass campaign of civil disobedience that we've seen in Britain for decades. And we should never, you never hear this in many of the mainstream parties or the media, but we should always restate that basic truth. But Margaret Thatcher, in a dotage, was asked in an interview, what do you think are your biggest political achievements? And interestingly enough, she said, I think my biggest achievement is changing the Labour Party. And again, that would explain, I think, a lot about its defeat in the recent elections. No, it wasn't because it was too left-wing. Just look at what happened with the SNP in Scotland. But yet we're seeing many Labour leadership candidates falling for the trap and arguing that in fact we just need to be more right-wing. But one of the reasons is because, of course, Labour was unable to challenge the deception that in the 7th richest economy on the planet, it's impossible to fund hospitals, schools, social care, all of the things that constitute a civilised society. When we see the richest 1,000 people in Britain have seen their wealth increase since the crash to the tune of 180 billion, it's doubled their wealth, enough to pay off the entire UK budget deficit in one go, and they'd still pocket about 40 billion. Now, need I say more in terms of the disparities that exist and the gross inequalities that exist in Britain and the rest of the world? That is the context for any serious discussion on unions and climate. Now, I'm proud of the role that PCS has played. We don't organise in the energy sector, but we do organise members in the regulatory bodies that oversee the energy sector, and it's based really on reflecting the growing awareness about the science, about a growing awareness of our members as part of the rest of the population, understanding the link between the burning of fossil fuels and the impact of climate change. And I'd make the point that whilst it was a result of ground-up pressure, rank-and-file pressure through our conferences, I make the point that any durable and lasting working class organisation has to be built from the ground up, but I also make the point that leadership can be important and decisive, and I think the elected left leadership of PCS have played an important role in challenging some of the myths against the climate deniers and the Clarksons and the Top Gear elements of this world, who continue to defy all of the scientific evidence that some of the brilliant material that trade unions of energy democracy, to name but one organisation, produce. So we make the point that climate is a trade union issue. Workplaces are responsible for over 50% of emissions. We've campaigned for workplace environmental reps to play a part within every workplace and to hold employers to account in the context of the Climate Act, a historic piece of legislation, weak and limited in many respects, but nevertheless a lever and a hook upon which unions can engage and hold employers to account over their actions around climate. We organise members in the Forestry Commission, where aligned with environmental activists, we stopped the privatisation of the forests. We see the scandal of fuel poverty at a time of the obscene profits of the 6 big energy giants, basically a cartel. And these are former public bodies that were privatised, who now have a complete grip of a rigged energy market, I should say, and continue to enjoy obscene levels of profits. Now, part of our alternative, one of the reasons why PCS, I think, has been able to play, without overstating it, having an impact in the debate about climate change, is because we argue it's not enough to oppose things, you've got to set out an alternative. And part of our alternative has been a project called Climate Jobs. And we, along with a number of other unions, environmental activists and a number of academics, produced a document that's able to show it's entirely feasible to create over 1 million jobs, arguably more, with supply chains, and at the same time reduce CO2 emissions by 80% over a 20-year period. And we've looked in detail of homes and retrofitting of homes and public buildings. And we've looked at the benefits of a clean, integrated public transport network. And we've looked at the benefits of investing in wind and wave technology. And in fact, I cite a bit of a case study because the area that the government want to frack, which is the Fylde Coast near a town called Blackpool, which is where I was brought up. And one of the great ironies is, and this is shown in our Climate Jobs pamphlet, is that Blackpool overlooks the Irish Sea. And if there's one thing it's not short of, it's wind and waves. And yet, and it is there, absolutely primed for investment in that particular technology, but no, instead, for all sorts of warped economic and political reasons, they prefer to risk the public health and rip up the countryside on the outskirts of the town in favour of shale, of shale gas. So the conclusion of this pamphlet is that the economic crisis and the climate crisis come from the same source. It is both a problem of market failure. And Sean referred to the Stern report. In fact, that talks about climate change being one of the greatest market failures in human history. And again, if it's from the same source, we need to think of a strategy about how we challenge an economic system that is actually the cause of it. So the point I'm making is that the fight against austerity is part of a fight for decisive action on climate change. Now, the evidence, there's much evidence of this. I'll give a couple of recent examples. One in the United States, as a consequence of Hurricane Sandy, that the healthcare unions in New York State have played a really important role working with Sean and other organisations because of the need to intervene in the context of the flooding, the massive flooding as a result of the hurricane. Again, it was obvious. We started to be able to see the link in very practical, tangible terms between climate change and the needs of trade union organisation. A similar argument prevails in Britain. Not the last winter, but the winter before was the wettest winter in British records. Huge flooding. As a result, the firefighters union, the FBU, was required to intervene. They have no statutory obligation to intervene in flooding. They're supposed to be there to put out fires, but as one of their senior officials said, you can be asked and called out to an incident of flooding, and it could be flooding in a basement in a town, on the outskirts in the home counties, or it could be Gloucestershire. They never know exactly what to expect. There is no provision, and that the cuts in and the cuts in the emergency and rescue services are highlighted graphically in moments of that particular character, which is why the Firefighters Union tabled a proposal to the British Trade Union Congress. It's the federation of all of the British unions. They tabled a motion that highlighted the impact of the cuts in the context of the flooding, made the link between the flooding and climate change, and PCS amended that motion and called on the TUC to carry out a consultation with all of the unions around extreme energy, and including a moratorium on fracking. Now, not entirely surprisingly, but still seen the outcome of this supposed consultation. It's a 6-page document. The consultation involved about 20 people, as far as I can see. It did not involve the consultation with affiliates, and its conclusion, surprise, surprise, is the status quo. The current energy mix, the current energy policy should be retained. It is a challenge to democracy within the trade union movement that must be challenged, but it's not entirely surprising when you recognise the relatively conservative nature of the TUC and some of the other unions. Now, this is in the context of a Tory government that he's now going to cut subsidies to renewables by any definition, and they're ironically increasing the powers of local authorities to obstruct the investment and building of onshore wind farms because it offends Tory squires. And yet at the same time, they've got a little bit of a dilemma because a county council in Lancashire only last Monday voted to reject the application of Quadrilla for the licence to frack just outside Blackpool. And that was an example of trade unionists, Unite, the biggest union in the UK, but many trade unionists and environmentalists and local campaigners coming together and putting pressure on the industry. It's a massive setback for the industry. They've got a real dilemma now, and they've got to rely on a Tory minister overruling local democracy if they're going to have any chance to frack in the future. Now let's come on to the question of fracking, because the GMB, Birch Union, I think we are. I think the good thing about the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy and forums like this is it enables a proper adult discussion about the whole of the issue. But the fact of the matter is that the GMB have signed an agreement with the industry for recognition and bargaining rights. Now, I would argue that's exactly what a trade union should do, that the union should always secure recognition and bargaining rights. And Bert earlier referred to the proud tradition of the GMB organising not just gas workers but many other sectors, a proud and militant tradition that has always to be respected. But it's one thing securing recognition, it's another thing becoming the voice, an open public advocate of the fracking industry, which is, I would argue, is what the GMB is now saying. And it's making, in my opinion, an error of judgment. It's not enough to pay lip service to the science, and really, it's not offering any real alternative to the status quo. Now, I want to say, really, in conclusion, that there are no easy answers to this. I think Sean's alluded to that. Bert's referred to that earlier, but I still come back to this question. It is a mistake for the trade union movement. We can emulate the biggest union in the UK that organises in the energy sector, Unite, 1.4 million workers. So it's not as if you have to, it's only the unions outside of the industry that can adopt this particular position. But at most, gas fracking will produce, it's estimated, between 5 or a maximum of 10% of gas production anyway. That the industry claims on jobs are at best exaggerated and I think are a deception, and there is still big questions about its economic viability, the amount of reserves, the cost of extraction and the profit that will be made. Throw into the equation the massive public opposition that exists in Britain, and we can defeat fracking in the UK and we can be confident of doing that. But I really just want to finish. I've referred to the fact that the actions around fracking, and a small example of that at Lancashire County Council, it comes back to this question, because there's one thing that not just reps in the energy sector in the GMB, but many other unions will legitimately ask the question, what exactly is a just transition? And you look at various woolly definitions of the ITUC and the British TUC as well, and none of which you would oppose per se, but they are insufficient. They're not sufficiently clear, and I believe that a just transition, and the virtue of discussions of is that it is possible to define a framework on a global scale that can then be applied on a domestic or a regional basis. In other words, to give just transition a radical, genuine content to fill the gaps between the very vague aspirations that most of the definitions currently follow. And what I mean is a meaningful definition. I mean tax justice that collects the tax, international cooperation, closing tax havens, transaction tax, closing all the loopholes. It's fundamental to this. We've got to enjoy clear workers' rights and political freedoms. We've got to raise the question of public health and the emergency and rescue services. There's got to be environmental and species protection. But there's got to be climate jobs initiatives, and we're seeing that initiative being picked up in Norway, in Belgium, South Africa, and a number of other countries, all of which looking to work out in a very concrete, specific and practical way how investment in renewables and environmental friendly approaches can create jobs and take decisive action at the same time. But most fundamentally, it's got to be built on public ownership models, and there's a considerable on that. And I think again, trade unions for energy democracy have done a lot of work looking at municipal examples, looking at cooperatives, but most importantly, we also need to look at how we exercise control, workers' control and public control of any institutions, public institutions that we create, because it's not enough to simply connect up a lot of small-scale initiatives. It will need to form part of a wider plan, but only one organised on a democratic democratic basis. And the other point, and this is really the core of it, there's got to be a new deal for energy workers. Energy workers will not be won over if we just simply offer some vague just transition and don't offer genuine material job protection. And I'm talking about job guarantees and protected rights. I'm talking about the right to be a member of a union and the union to bargain, about proper pensions and social security provision, about energy sector regulation and public ownership, but most fundamentally, and one or two of Sean's graphs illustrated this, a genuine transition that has got to be about moving away from fossil fuel production towards to a reliance on renewables. That can't be done overnight, but that's where the dialogue needs to take place. That's where the trade unions need to engage, because we've got to give and meaning to when we talk about a new deal for energy workers and when we talk about a transition. Now, there are other aspects of this. It's got to be built on international solidarity and opposition to things like TTIP and the trade deals that, as Naomi Klein's book highlights, are often underlie many of the excuses and used by the energy companies and respective governments to promote a fossil fuel agenda. But really, of course, I just want to say all of that is somewhat abstract if it's not underpinned by a willingness to organise and to recognise that without struggle, where we're seeing protests of the young in the UK, where we need coordinated strikes in the UK, where we now need to mobilise on a scale we've never seen before, if we're going to be able to oppose what our current government is seeking, but to use this as an opportunity to set out a genuine alternative. So thanks very much for listening, and thanks again for the invite.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. So I'm going to hand over to Bert for 5 minutes.
Very
told me, very briefly.
Very briefly. I'm going to make myself
so we have some time for questions and reflection.
Yeah, I'm going to make myself very unpopular. And I'm going to put a question for you, a dilemma really. Now, I'll preface my remarks by saying I agree entirely with everything that Chris has said. And my union, the GMB, recognises that we have to cut down the use of fossil fuels to an absolute minimum, and it has to be replaced by renewables. We live on an island, we're surrounded by sea. It's perfectly adaptable to using wind energy. We can use solar energy, but there are going to be times when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, even if the government actually had the willingness to build a renewable alternative. Because quite frankly, the British energy policy is a mess. It is a complete mess, and I think we'll all agree with that. But even if we had the renewables, we had the solar power, there will always be a need for a base fuel. So say when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, it's going to be gas. It is going to be gas. We'll always need gas, for example, for industry. For example, this cup is going to be made in a factory that needs to burn energy, and it's going to be gas. So we are going to need some gas. Now, at the moment, gas in Britain comes from the North Sea, yeah, and it is there have been accidents in the North Sea, a relatively safe environment for extracting gas. It's going to run out. Now, at the moment, we're already importing gas from Qatar, for example, on tankers. Liquid gas is coming in. We're also bringing gas in pipelines from Belgium, but it doesn't come from Belgium. It actually comes from Russia, so it's a long pipeline all the way from Russia to the UK. So the GMB made a decision that they wouldn't actively oppose fracking because there's a need for gas supplies. Part of the reason that the GMB decided not to entirely oppose fracking was because, and you might find this surprising, for environmental reasons. Because one of the criticisms of fracking, and it's a very valid criticism, is the release of methane gas when it's extracted. Methane gas is probably the worst greenhouse gas. Its effects are far worse than CO2. One of the many reasons why fracking should be opposed. But here comes the dilemma. It has been argued by scientists that the amount of methane that is released in a pipeline coming all the way from Russia to England is very significant. I haven't got the exact figures. Similarly, the amount of methane that's released on tankers coming from Qatar. There's also a political argument. Do we want to be dependent upon getting gas from a regime like Qatar, which is no respecter of labour rights, which is no respecter of workers' rights? So that's the dilemma. North Sea gas is going to run out. I can't tell you when, but the way it's going, because there is no movement to renewables, the gas has been used at considerable rates. Clearly that has to come down. And I should tell you though, there are some exciting new developments for the use of gas in combined heat and power units, which means gas will be used to generate electricity domestically with virtually no emissions. So there is a role for gas, I would argue, in the future. But the big problem for us as a GMB is, where is that gas going to come from? And how do we get over the fact that the North Sea gas is going to run out? We all agree we should leave fossil fuels in the ground, but the trouble is, here in the UK, the fossil fuels are in the wrong place, if you see what I mean, yeah? So that's what I'd ask you to think about. For a country like the UK, how do you get around this dilemma if you know you're going to have to use gas, albeit a very reduced amount of gas, if in an ideal world much of the gas consumption is replaced by renewables? So that's the question I'm going to put to you, and I'd love you to come up with some answers, so I can go back to the GMBs, the play the fish, and say, maybe this one again. Okay?
Okay, thank you very much, Brett. Okay. Obviously, I'll come right back. Obviously, harmony is gone with your
Thanks a lot.
with your speech. I think because people got really sort of nervous and wanting to say lots. So I take
Joe at the back.
and I think what will be interesting is also to hear some voices from the south, because generally speaking we now had a perspective more from the north, so maybe if people from the south could put up their hands, that would be great. Okay, 1, 2, 3, north, 4. Okay, 1, please, Clara.
Very quickly, I think all due respect to Bert, you're putting your union's position, but I think your whole question is based on an assumption that is got nothing scientific about we're going to need gas. So therefore, your question is not really relevant. Also, the way the GMB took that decision hasn't been a democratic process, and you signed this agreement with UCOG, the lobby body for fracking, before you even had the resolution at your conference. But that's aside. I think about the South, I also want to hear about that South. Is it a topic that you are discussing with your trade union? Because I think we see now that there's more climate refugees in the world than there is for war refugees. And you know, this is going to carry on. So I think I'm really interested to have the conversation later on with Sean at 6:30, and hopefully we'll hear what's happening in your country.
Thank you very much. Number 2.
Yeah, just sort of what it want to cover, illustrate that small example of why I do feel that the gas argument is based on a status quo paradigm. For example, we're just talking about production here. There's a lot of technological changes that need to happen in the UK that will change what needs to be produced, what's going to be the makeup of our energy. For example, our national grid has not been invested in solar and
Chair.
Thank you very much. Number 3. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Khalid Mahmood. Well, totally different world. At the moment, we have temperatures of 5 plus, and we have electricity load shedding of around 12 to 14 hours a day in the cities, and in the villages, you can imagine. We have consumed all our gas, almost all our gas. We have very limited oil resources. Now we are trying to import gas from Qatar through the oil tankers, through the sea, and then we are trying to build a gas pipeline with Iran. For the gas consumption and for producing electricity as well. Our governments in late 80s and 90s started with the electricity generation companies, independent IPPs, independent power producers, for producing electricity on oil, through oil. And that is the most expensive electricity that we are getting. Our governments have not built on alternative energy resources. So, and now we have found that we have Asia's biggest coal reserves in one of our areas. And the government is planning to produce electricity through those coal reserves. The trade unions have no idea at all what is happening in the climate change movement, what is happening and what discussions are going on. The global union federations have played no effective role to educate the trade unions in Pakistan, their affiliates. What is it all about? Some NGOs are doing if the trade unions in the north are going to fight or going to build a campaign on the climate change, they will definitely to involve the unions from the south. But unions have no education, they have no idea. So if you want to save the world, you will be destroying the world in the next 60 years actually. Because we will be consuming all that coal and all these resources. So there is a need to work together.
Okay. Thank you very much. Number 4.
Paula from the south of Ireland.
Good effort.
Well, I think Mahmoud did his job.
On the island of Ireland, we have discovered also some natural resources, but the method that they want to use is fracking. And there's been localised campaigns to stop this. The exact same targeting county councils, so politically doing it, but the local councils have been disenfranchised from making decisions about key planning decisions. This is all the way that politics has worked to kind of take power away from and centralise it. But the point really is that Ireland, as you know, is divided into the north and south. But the area they want to frack is covering Fermanagh and Leitrim, areas which are cross-border. And what is actually quite exciting about this is that this is one of the first or few campaigns in the fight, against this destruction of our environment, the fight for climate justice, is actually bringing communities together that never have worked together, that have always traditionally been enemies, sometimes fought each other, killed each other, all of that. And what's really interesting about it is that, first of all, people are coming together in the interest of humanity, the environment, all of that, but also trade unions like Unite are situating themselves at the also, not dominating it, not owning it, but naturally being involved, so that they are part of the justice working in society. But just to say that, so in terms of taking it back to your own countries, if unions aren't in climate justice, there are examples of where it's happening. You can be subtle or you can be very kind of forthright, but it's important for unions to be involved in these social justice campaigns.
Okay, thank you very much. Number 5. Can I ask you to be really short so we can sort of bring in more people into discussion?
With Manuel, earlier you didn't talk of scientific authority, but when you of science, I was a bit it got my ears up. But I feel it's not just enough to look at, not see oils driving. What are the consequences of fracking? I mean, what are people with? This is the spoliation of environment. So I think that it shouldn't just be that aspect of it's running out. I want to focus more on the issue of this. In Africa, it's quite close to what Khalid said with regards to there is very poor level of concern of the trade unions. I have participated in an African climate justice network. I've participated more in it as a civil society activist. Also national convener of the United Action for Democracy, which is a coalition of political rights-based civil society organizations. You notice that it's basically the ITUC Africa that participates in the network, and there's no link, no feedback. Even within the organs of the ITUC, I'll say there's a person from ITUC that participates. Then, well, finally, I think, but there's some silver lining. You asked us to talk, now you're saying that anyway, the bottom line is that there's a silver lining, like the issue of the 1 million climate jobs, which Kusatu also bought into. Like a few years back, I discussed with Jonathan Nell about the possibilities of the NLC, the Nigerian Labour Congress. When I raised this, and this was in a situation where you had the worst floods in 60 years in Nigeria that rendered about 1 million people displaced and about 200 people dead, including 4 suicides, farmers whose farmlands got washed away and they took their lives. And the issue was, well, this is important, but apart from, the thing is, the West have already developed, they have grown, they cannot tie our hands to grow. You know, so that is one thing that we have to buy, but there are possibilities, but it's not yet as recognized as it should issue. But silver linings in the dark clouds. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Dave, very short,
very
and then
short.
I'll give the floor
Just to pick up from what Khalid was saying about the need for the global unions to really invest into education programs around climate change. Just give one example of the good work that's been done in the International Transport Workers Federation. You can imagine among the transport workers, there are people in civil airlines, in the trucking industry and so on, who would be very fiercely resistant, you would think, to work around climate change. It's been a very democratic debate inside the ITF, and indeed climate change is one of the key issues they debated at the last Congress, and they have full-time staff on climate change within the ITF, so I recommend you look at their website on that. The other thing is to succinctly point out the relationship between climate change and the essential need to organise informal workers. Because the role of informal workers, both plus and minus, in terms of is extremely important. I could talk about that for 10 minutes, but I won't.
Okay, thank you. Now I'll give the floor to first, because he's got to catch a taxi at the then to Bert, Sean, if necessary.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I think there was always an inherent risk in certainly my presentation that it was going to orientate perhaps too much to the UK and the global north, and I entirely take the point that this is a discussion that needs to be conducted on an international basis. And my thinking really, and this emerged from the discussion at the Trade Unions and Energy sort of summit last week in the United States, was the concept of coming back, giving content and a more radical content to the concept of just transition, but to do so in a way that is on a global basis. We start talking about a global framework, and we can apply this, domestically within each nation and on a regional basis. And I think that's the point I'm trying to make here, is that we can learn from one another. That one of the arguments against fracking in the UK is because of the experience in the US and how it's been documented in a whole series of reports. And it isn't just about the debates about the numbers of jobs and about planning applications, etc., it is fundamentally, continues to contribute to CO2 emissions that unless we arrest that, then of course we all know what the scientific consequences would be. So it's no good talking about just transition and acknowledging in one way the lip service of the science without taking decisive action towards reducing CO2 emissions. Now, on the question, touched on this point, I think this is where we would differ. I think I don't accept the proposition that we are perpetually dependent on gas. Now, that's not to say that anybody, certainly a trade unionist, would advocate the immediate closure of all the gas-fired power stations in the UK. That's why we say to be a genuine, tangible, worked-out just transition. And that's got to involve a phasing out and a reduction of the burning of gas and all fossil fuels that continue to contribute to climate change. So the idea that the choice in any way in the UK, for example, is fracking or importing or piping in gas from Qatar and Russia is a completely false choice. And it comes back to the question of how we can define in a meaningful way a just transition that on the one hand it produces the decisive reductions but addresses the interests of workers. Because if the workers' interests in the sector are not at the core and at the very heart of this debate, then we're not going to be in a position to achieve what I think a number of speakers have rightly pointed out. We've got to bring the labour and the environmental movement together. And there's been over many decades a degree of mistrust. The environmental, I'll just give you one example, and I'm struck by features of the environmental campaign, Reclaim the Power in the UK, and I went along to one of the camps, and I so impressed that this was a camp organised on the outskirts of Blackpool because of the risk of fracking. They'd found the field, they'd set up the tents, it was like a mini city, set up within about 48 hours. And I think of how at times the trade union movement would have needed to commission a working party that would have sat for about 6 months producing a feasibility report looking at the various fields and options. So I use that as I'm being slightly facetious because there are, the unions can be very cumbersome and very bureaucratic and slow in their decision making. They can be imperfect institutions, but they come in many shapes and sizes, and the good unions are the ones where the members control it. Are the one where the members are participate and engage and control it and shape the policy. And I think the environmental movement can learn from the of organising trade unions, and particularly in the energy sector, and we can learn a hell of a lot from some of the tactics and methods that are deployed by the environmental movement. And you're beginning to see a diminishing of the mistrust. And you're beginning to see, and I think, reference Naomi Klein's book contributes to that particular process. Now, say one quick point about the global south. That I think that this is Sean will this that Greece is in proportion to its GDP imports fossil fuels than any other country in Europe, in the Eurozone. Now, let's look at the geography of a country like Greece. Again, there's no shortage of heat and sun. And particularly many other parts of the global south, that it is there waiting for a huge public investment in solar energy. There, again, is one specific, while we may talk about wind and wave technology in aspects of the global north, obviously in many, many parts of the global south, we're looking on a mass scale investment in the solar technologies, which the price of which is coming down all the time, and massive evidence to show how technically feasible and affordable that is. So again, I just want to thank everybody for the opportunity to say a few words. And I do think fundamental to this whole discussion, we mean in detail by a just transition that has the effect of bringing the organised working class, and let's not forget the millions unorganised in the working class, who I believe that huge strides could be made forward, You see this in every country. Sections of the working class that have been neglected by the trade union movement but need to be brought into the ranks of the trade union movement through effective organising and speaking and acting as unions should, but to build more and more links with the environmental movement so that we can put the pressure on the politicians, but most importantly build the mass movement that's going to be needed to achieve what it is that we want. So I'll shut up there.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. All right, thank you very much again. Shame you have to leave, but all the luck for negotiations to strike for National Gallery. So, Bert, would you like to comment on
on the specific
the
GMB
discussion
point?
on the gas?
I mean, it was said there's no scientific reason to continue with gas. Well, with the most optimistic scenario in the world, even the green groups will tell you that gas is going to be with us for the foreseeable future. Nearly every home in this country has a gas boiler. It's going to be a huge job to change that. So it is going to be with us with some decades to come. And I do take issue with the PCS comrade that said the GMB was anti-democratic in the decision it took. I feel quite insulted by that. I personally do not agree with the decision the GMB took. I'm anti-fracking myself. I agree with the arguments that Chris puts up. However, it went to our Congress in June, it was debated on the floor, it was voted upon, and it was carried. And I was there when the agreement was signed, and it was not done before the members voted on it. So I want to make that very clear. So I think it's up to you as trade unionists, people like Chris, is to persuade our people to change that decision by the dialogue that Chris has talked about. Because I think the vote was taken. There were reasons. I think I've touched on the reasons that were given why it was taken in the way it was. Don't necessarily agree with it. I'm a hired hand. The members voted for it, but that doesn't mean to say that's not going to change in the future. Mm-hmm. But one thing we certainly do agree with, and there's no difference between any of us here, is there has to be public ownership of energy generation. There has to be public ownership of the grid, because otherwise decisions will be made on the basis of profit, and the market cannot be left to decide such a serious issue. So on the issue of public ownership, there is no difference between us whatsoever.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. Good to see you.
Good luck.
I have 2 or 3 minutes just to sum it up and answer a few questions. I have proposed, through the Unions for Energy Democracy Network, we've been in discussions with Unison, with GMB, a little bit with Unite and PCS, and 1 or 2 other unions. And there needs to be a trade union commission to explore Britain's energy future. I'm just talking about Britain now, but it could be any country could apply this. What's the trade union approach that takes on board the climate question, the pollution question, the health question, the costs and the jobs? What's our vision? What we got now in the British trade union movement is 1 or 2 unions who accept that this is the time to reassert public ownership, and there are others who just believe the confidence that we can win that fight under this government at this point in history. I understand the challenges, but what does it hurt to get in a room, once a month for a year and come up with some plan? And let's answer the question, how much gas do we need? Because Bert is right. It's true for the planet. We cannot, it's easy to say leave it in the ground, but we have a whole economy, north and south, increasingly south, that's built up on fossil fuels. Getting off of that is not going to be easy if you include motor vehicles as well. They're fossil fuels as well. So how are you going to get the fleet, the vehicle fleet, to run on renewable power? So these are huge challenges. This is not something that we can just, sidestep. But Unison, for example, produced a report saying that electricity consumption in the US at the domestic and commercial level can be up to a quarter less if we insulated all the buildings. That's work. Yeah. That's work. They also said in that report, we won't need to do high volume fracking if we do conservation. So the pieces of the program, of the perspective, can be there. The only way you're going to have mass insulation of buildings is either by strict regulation or done as a public works project in the same way as public works projects were organised in the past. One issue I didn't take up for lack of time is the issue of energy poverty. What about the 1 billion or 1.3 billion people in the world who don't have access to electricity, and another 1 billion who have unreliable access? Now, the answer again of the capitalist is, well, the World Bank says this is how you do it. You go in and you extend microfinancing to villages. You borrow money and buy your solar panels, and then at a rate of interest, of course, you'll pay it back over a period of years. Give me a break. First of all, what about the grid? It's not just sticking a solar panel on a hut somewhere. It's about how do you integrate renewables into the grid. So you've got to have billions of investment into the infrastructure. That can only be done through the public, through public funds, through public bonds, through taxing the rich, through a carbon tax and those kind of aggressive mechanisms. But we have to remember that there's 1 billion or 2 billion people who have this big challenge of not being able to turn on the lights. Another issue I didn't mention, but I flag it because it's really important. The World Health Organization said in 2012, 1 in 8 fatalities in the world were associated with fossil fuels. Approximately 7 million people died due to exposure. Indoor exposure, through diesel, through fires, through coal pollution. In China and India, they call it the airpocalypse now because of the air quality issues. And of the 25 most polluted cities in the world, 20 are in Asia. So we may think when we look at the clear skies, there's no more coal mining around here, there's very little smog anymore in the UK. Don't think that that is the global picture. It is not. Last couple of things to say on this. I appeal to unions here to get involved in this. The usual reaction is, we're not an energy union, we don't know anything about energy, we organise somewhere else. If you are or India, you are going to breathe the same atmosphere that everybody else is going to breathe. And so if an energy union supports fracking in the UK, you should be writing a letter to them now saying we oppose this decision because your methane gas that's going to be released into the atmosphere is an atmosphere that we all have to live in. So we have as much right as you, if not more right, to challenge your decision. So don't be intimidated by unions saying that's our jobs you're interfering with. Because this is your air they're interfering with. And the unions are in support fossil fuels have to be aware they are inflicting damage on other parts of the world, including their own backyard, but other parts of the world, with communities who are going to be suffering the ill health and the pollution and the heat and the agricultural damage and the droughts and the typhoons. That's the message we have to send to all unions. We are all energy unions. We all have to struggle for energy democracy. I hope you see me at 6:30 because we're going to have a really good time talking about how you do that. And I'm really excited about this project. I want to involve as many unions as possible into this struggle, and because we need your help to build it. Thanks. Thanks very much.
Okay, I'd just like to underline what Sean said. UNIA is a member of trade unions for energy democracy, and I met Sean 4 years ago, and in UNIA we've now made some steps forward, and we have a document which is going to be submitted to a commission to investigate what UNIA for climate change. So it's possible. It's a lot of work and needs a lot of persistence in unions, because first thing they always say is we're not really concerned. So I think what you just said is really important. I think we're going to close here. I can see that people would like to discuss longer, but we've already a quarter of an hour longer. I think others are probably tired also because we had a long day. We had a long session this afternoon. There is the possibility to join Sean at 6:30 to continue the discussion, asking all your questions or putting forward your comments and ideas. So I suggest we close. There's going to be the film after dinner, 7:30. Maybe you can tell us, is it going to be here?
It's going to be here.
Okay, it's going to be here in this room,
Is Sarah
7:30.
Nell here, by the way? Is Sarah Nell here?